Okay, so we are going to talk about something that can be seen as a bit contentious sometimes. This is the exposure triangle. I am sure that you have heard the words exposure triangle before. Now, some people might go and say, well, there's no such thing. It's bad to teach this. You shouldn't teach this. It's inaccurate. It's incorrect. Well, I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that for a few reasons. And I want to tell you this straight away just so that we can kind of make sure that we're all on the same page with this. The exposure triangle is a simplification of how the different settings work together on your camera in order to create the exposure that you're looking for. It's trying to, and I think pretty successfully, explains the relationship between the three settings, because we want to make sure that you have a practical use, a practical understanding of the settings. So the exposure triangle is a great way to get an understanding of how your shutter speed and your aperture interact together, your aperture and your ISO interact together, and so on. These three settings, hence the triangle, do play together. Okay, so it is more complicated than that. It gets more technical than that. There's a lot of, additional information that can go into this. But for the sake of learning how to take the pictures you want to take, the exposure triangle is a wonderful fundamental tool to help you to get to understand that. So below you are going to see an example of the exposure triangle that you can interact with just to get a good understanding of it. There's also a downloadable version, so you can kind of just stick it on your phone or something if you want a reminder of what these different pieces do. And then it's really, like I said, just a great way to kind of start to understand how these three settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, work together to determine how much light comes into your camera sensor or film. One thing I will say is you do want to remember, and I mentioned this in our first video, that there is ambient light that is also part of the equation. We don't have a section on the exposure triangle about ambient light, but we live in the real world. We know that light exists, or doesn't exist depending. So it's kind of a given. Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure that we're, understanding this in a very practical way and not a pedantic way. So your exposure triangle has your three settings: your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And the purpose of this is to help you to understand what happens if you change your shutter speed, what happens to the aperture, what happens to the ISO. How does the ISO affect if you turn that up? How does that affect the aperture and the shutter speed? Okay, so I want you to go through, I want you to look at the exposure triangle. I want you to read, even if you have a good understanding of these three settings, I want you to go ahead and read below our little descriptions of each of them, just again, so that we're all on the same page with our verbiage and we're using a common vocabulary. So go ahead and read through our exposure triangle, and then we're going to start talking about each of those settings individually.